Hello and welcome to World Talks. I'm your host, Diana Skaya. Now in this episode, we focused on developments in the South Caucasus, specifically in Georgia, where the country has pushed back its bid to join the EU until 2029. And now the government is facing questions over a new migration law, changing admission rules for citizens of several developing countries starting May 16. Georgia will allow visa-free entry for citizens for 17 additional countries, mostly from Africa, a move that has sparked debate about its shifting geopolitical direction. Now, as Georgia broadens its international partnerships, many are asking, is the country quietly distancing itself from Europe, and moving closer to a path more in line with Russian interests? Well, to help us unpack this, I'm joined by Tinatin Japaridze, Geopolitical Risk Analyst at Eurasia Group. Our guest specializes in geopolitics and security in Eurasia. Tinatin, welcome to TVP World Talks.
Thank you, Diana.
All right, so a lot has been happening in Georgia over the past few months. Why is Georgia, let's stick to specifically what's going on right now. Why would you say that Georgia is suddenly opening visa-free travel to people from 17 more countries? And we're talking about, of course, mainly African countries. What could be at stake here? What's going on?
So I think, Diana, that this move by the Georgian Dream government reflects a very deliberate effort to essentially diversify its foreign policy. Now, the timing amid increasing tensions with the EU suggests that Tbilisi is seeking leverage and alternative relationships as it recalibrates its position and trajectory. Now, on the surface, this appears to be directly aligned with the government's broader strategy to open new avenues for political and economic cooperation beyond its traditional Western partnerships. It signals an effort, in a way, to reposition Georgia as a more globally engaged country, so to speak, and one that is far less oriented exclusively on the European Union and the West more broadly. But ultimately, this is a very dangerous path and one that is inevitably going to isolate Tbilisi from its traditional allies in the West.
All right, let's get into that a little bit further. You just said dangerous. What kind of dangers are we looking at? Is this also, you just said it yourself, though. I don't know, Georgia getting closer to countries even like Saudi Arabia and Qatar, for instance, and moving away to those closer ties to Europe. What kind of danger are we seeing here? But let's also talk about, I'd like you to tell me also about how this would actually affect ordinary Georgians and what happens inside Georgia itself.
Well, at the moment, the recalibration appears to be very significant, and it is noteworthy, but I don't believe that it's actually entirely irreversible. So I did want to touch on that this is not final. As of right now, obviously, this is the position of the Georgian Dream. But Diana, I think you're alluding to the fact that the government in its current form seems to be on one side. And then on the other side of the barricades are the majority of the Georgian people who think and feel very differently from what the government is doing at the moment. Now, obviously, the Georgian government, the Georgian Dream's government, is very clearly charting what it describes as a more balanced sort of course. In reality, it's a far more Eurasia-oriented, or a course that is as far away from the West as Georgia has been since the collapse of the Soviet Union. But the large segments of Georgian society and the opposition parties do remain wholeheartedly committed to the country's European aspirations and integration. So in many ways, the Georgian Dream's current trajectory and policies that are blatantly anti-democratic, this all increases the risk of a more durable tilt away from Europe. And also, you mentioned security risks, and there are going to be many, because when you don't have a partner such as the European Union as a bloc, many individual European countries that have been longtime allies of Georgia that due to this pivot of Tbilisi away from the West are also going to start distancing themselves from Georgia, that puts Georgia in a very isolated and a very precarious position where it will have very few allies to turn to. So then it starts to rely on the neighbors such as Russia, for example, also countries like China that have vested interests in Georgia. So this is all in all not great news for the Georgian people.
And say, just a little more, say that the EU, for instance, given a scenario that they would suspend visa-free travel privileges for Georgians in response to the government's embrace of authoritarian practices. How serious is that risk right now? What happens then?
Well, that is a very serious risk, and one that the Georgian dream is trying to downplay, to make it look as though it's really the West and the European Union in particular that is suddenly closing the door for all Georgians without any provocations. But of course, we have been watching very closely what's happening in Georgia, and we do know that this did not start overnight, and the Georgian dream has been working on this pivot away from Europe, away from its EU integration process over the past couple of years. So the risk of losing the visa-free access to the European Union is something that does worry many Georgians who still see their future in Europe and within Europe and as part of the broader European family. Now, we should also be very realistic and note the fact that when we talk about the Georgians who care a great deal about programs such as visa liberalization, we are really talking about those who reside in Tbilisi and a handful of other larger cities in the country. If we're being completely realistic, Diana, I think we do have to admit that actually those others who don't reside in the big cities in Georgia will care a little bit less about Georgians' ability to travel to European capitals and to European cities. And they are mostly going to be bothered about essentially the bread and butter issues, which is something that the Georgian Dream leaders know very well, and they are trying to pander to those. But of course, what happens is that something similar to what we saw in October of last year, when the Georgian Dream lost in the majority of the larger cities in the country, they end up alienating their electorate, their voters in places like Tbilisi. And that is a very serious risk for them. So if those Georgians lose the ability to travel to Europe visa-free amid the ongoing democratic backsliding, political repressions, lack of freedom of the media and the press, then of course that becomes a massive problem for them down the line, and they can put this off for as long as they want, but ultimately they will eventually have to deal with these issues that they are actually single-handedly creating for themselves.
Let me ask you with this. It's no secret that some of these, I have the list in front of me here. Among these 17 countries, let's be honest, a lot of these countries are facing big problems at home. Now, do you think that this could lead to more asylum seekers or illegal migration through Georgia should they arrive to Georgia?
Well, it could. It could. And I think what we would end up seeing is something similar, but in a different way, what we saw with an influx of Russians that came to Georgia when the full-scale invasion of Ukraine started. They left Russia. They flocked over to countries like Georgia, like Armenia. And what we ended up seeing, at least in the Georgian case, is that many of them were then able to use Georgia as a shortcut and a ticket to places like Western Europe, for example. So that does become a problem. Also, then Georgia becomes a hub for them where they are going to be able to relatively easily open their own businesses, their LLCs, there are pathways for them to be able to make Georgia home, at least temporarily for themselves. So these are risks that Georgians are aware of. And also then we're talking about, irrespective of who the refugees may be and who the tourists who decide to stay in Georgia longer term may be. And we are not pointing any fingers at anyone, but frankly, what happens is once you have more and more foreigners, the prices overall in the country start to skyrocket, which is what we saw after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And suddenly, a lot of the goods become unaffordable for regular Georgian citizens. So there are a lot of issues with this, and there is reason for Georgians to be concerned, mildly speaking.
Let me ask you a little bit of a controversial question here. Again, on this list, I mean, you did mention Armenia there. Georgia and Armenia are the two only predominantly Christian countries in the South Caucasus, surrounded by all predominantly Muslim neighbors. I want to ask you this: public perception, along with those other issues, everything that you just enumerated here, could religion or could this? I don't know. Could Georgians worry about people coming in from these 17 countries and possibly having that clash that Georgians will begin to seeking? I mean, you mentioned how first the Russians came in, and we all know, of course, how the Georgian and Russian relations were before. I mean, we've had protests going on in Georgia for the past few months because of this as well. How are ordinary Georgians looking at that, or is it even a question mark? Is it a factor even?
I think you're being very honest that this is a controversial question, but I also
That's why I said it's a controversial question.
Absolutely, but it's an important topic, and I think we should mention that amid all of the challenges and the issues that Georgia has experienced over the past decades and even centuries, I think tolerance overall when it comes to religious minorities, ethnic minorities, that has actually been one of the issues that Georgia has been able to deal with very skillfully. So I don't think that this will immediately be a problem that becomes sort of a top of mind issue for most Georgians. I think partly because Georgians have that experience. They have also been dealing with occupations even before the Russian and later Soviet occupation, and then followed by another post-Soviet Russian occupation. They were occupied by other powers, and some of them were Muslim countries. So it's something that Georgia is able to deal with. And as you know, Diana, Georgian people in general, although Georgia is home to many different religions, at the same time, Georgians do consider the Christian Orthodox Church to be a vital part of its national identity. And it's something that Georgians are very proud of. So I think that in terms of them not fearing for their own identity, their own religion, I think they feel very confident in that respect. The bigger issue will be whether then Georgia will be used in terms of security, borders, etc., as this sort of proxy and a hub, essentially. The Tbilisi airport then becomes a hub for people trying to sort of bypass the law and regulations, and that becomes a much, much bigger issue, and something that I am not entirely sure that the Georgian Dream leadership is actually thinking about long and hard at the moment.
What about Russia's role in this decision? Is there anywhere that Russia, I mean, we know about Russia's role in Africa, but could this be linked somehow, or do you not see that taking place here?
So that's a really interesting question, because this is a topic that many colleagues of mine and I debate, where we're trying to figure out what sort of Russian influence are we really talking about? Are we literally talking about someone picking up the phone in Moscow and calling Tbilisi and speaking to the Georgian Dream leaders and telling them precisely what to do? Or are we talking about a more subtle influence / pressure? I do think that to a degree, it's more of the latter rather than the former. But having said that, anything that is related to Georgia's foreign policy, that to me at least, seems like the sort of a decision that cannot be made single-handedly by the Georgian Dream leaders. I think there are some consultations happening. It is not coincidental that oftentimes we do see certain statements that are coming out of Tbilisi that echo what had been said the day prior in Moscow and vice versa. So I do think that this is yet another signal that Moscow does play a role, particularly in Georgia's foreign policy. And whenever something is in direct opposition to Moscow's own interests and goals, or vice versa, if something really helps Moscow and makes its life easier, then of course the Georgian Dream has to bear this in mind. And overall, everything that we are seeing in terms of the foreign policy moves of the Georgian Dream is in many ways something that Russia stands to benefit from in quite a few ways.
Thank you so much, Tinatin Japaridze, Geopolitical Risk Analyst at the Eurasia Group, for all your input, all your insight on the unfolding situation in Georgia. And we will watch closely, of course, as to what happens on the 16th of May. Thanks for being with us.
Dziękuję bardzo.
And that's all for this edition of World Talks. I'm Diana Skaya. Thanks for watching.